Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. So some of you remember this when you were growing up. This is funny. I'll never forget. My first one was actually Kelly Kapowski too. I was a big Saved by the Bell fan. Come home and watch that, and then it was funny when you think about this. Your celebrity crush was just like a part of your like upbringing. If many of you can remember early on who that was, many of you remember like middle school, the first time you had a crush. How many of you remember the first time you asked a girl out in middle school? Anybody ever ask a girl out but never go anywhere? Anybody else do that? Let me ask you this: how many of you passed a note with a gel pen at some point growing up? I'm getting all my millennials in one swoop. Yeah, wrote the note. Yeah. You did this. Yeah. It's so funny when you think about this. Like, young love is so fascinating. And it was always funny to me, too, is like somebody said this to me growing up. They're like, puppy love is real to puppies. And I was like, that's kind of true. Like, when you were growing up, there's a piece of this where, like, you would say, I love you, and you thought you meant it, but you kind of mean it different now. Like, there's a piece of this that's a little bit different. And so the basis of this series is this, that many of us at some point want to get married, and many of you did get married, and some of you are single, and you're looking. Some of you are engaged, or you're dating, and some of you are single and you're like, you know what, I'm not, but you have friends that are. We're all processing some version of this together. And so what we did last week is, I said this earlier, we laid a foundation for where we're going to go throughout this series. But today what I want to do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time focusing specifically on you. Now, when I grew up, what we did is I grew up around the church, and what was fun is I had a youth pastor in middle school who set us all down. He got all the guys to sit down, and he was talking about this. I think we were doing like a dating series. I was pretty young. And he did this. He said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go this week, just take a piece of paper, and I want you to write down make a list of all the things that you want in a spouse one day, which wasn't that weird for us. You know, we had been talking about dating, marriage, all that kind of stuff from the time I was a kid. And so, we all went off and we, wrote all of these things, and most everything was Kelly Kapowski. That was my entire sheet. It was pretty much that. And then we got back, and I love this. When we got back the next week to the small group, he said, okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to take that, and I want you to put that aside. It's not that it's bad to have that, but now that you've done that, what I want you to actually focus on is who is it that you need to become between now and whenever it is that you meet whoever it is that you're going to meet. And so a group of, young middle school guys then go back, and we have to start writing down all of these things. And that list was a whole lot shorter than my other list. You know what I mean? Like, it was so fascinating to think. Like, it was so easy for me to think out there, but it was harder for me to think about internal. And what's fascinating to me, too, is as I talk to people, a lot of people didn't grow up thinking about who they were going to become. Now, a lot of you grew up and you thought about all the things that you should and should not do. Right, and this is different. Like, many of you grew up and you got in trouble sometimes, or you went to timeout. Your parents were very good at teaching you about all the things that you should do or should not do, but there wasn't a lot of focus about who it is that you were supposed to become. But I put it in my notes to say it this way: but what you do is driven by who you have become to this point. And there's no way around that, right? Your decisions are affected by who you are, and the level of strategic thought that you've put into who it is that you are becoming and who you've become to this point actually affects your decision making more than just about anything else. It affects it more than your environment. It affects it more than your circumstances. Your decision making around who you're going to be in the future affects you so deeply. Now, the problem around this, and this is what you've seen, and I've seen this with friends or people that I've counseled over the years, is this: that a lot of people don't think about who they are, and they don't think about their personal values, they don't think about their character until it becomes urgent. And at some point along the way, the urgency around a crack in their character, or a lack of personal values, or a lack of clarity about where they're going actually creates a difficult moment. So I put it in my notes to say it this way: that when it comes to this, poorly defined values will not demand attention until it's urgent. And at some point along the way, your poorly defined values, it's just like they go off. It's like something or circumstance or a set of decisions finally catches up with your, sort of life and decision making. And by that point, oftentimes it's too late. That by the time it feels urgent for you to create or to correct a character thing or a lack of values or a lack of direction, by the point that you feel that and the point that it feels urgent, that's actually the point that oftentimes you're experiencing or about to experience a set of consequences that are really damaging to either yourself, the people that you care about, or people that are within your sphere of influence. So I'm going to give you the whole map of where we're going to go today. We're going to look at 6 short verses in a passage of the Old Testament that kind of gets left out of the conversation. And then after that, I'm going to do this. I'm going to just overload you with as much practical information around how to do this as we can, right? Now, so the area of the Bible we're going to look at, the area of the Bible called Daniel. If you've never read this, this is the part of the Bible where many of us, you were brought up around like Vacation Bible School, where it's like Daniel, there's some lions involved. It ended up being a bad day for a lot of people except for Daniel. Like there's a little bit of this. And that's a fascinating, fun, story to tell when you're a kid. The stuff going on around this, though, is actually, I think, so much more fascinating, and who he is and who he becomes. And so the way that some of this comes about, a little bit of context to it, is what happens is Daniel was amongst a group of Jewish boys who were taken into captivity. And as they were, the end goal for this group of young Jewish boys was them to be essentially changed or transformed into a brand new culture. Right? So the end goal for them was to be indoctrinated into a new religion, a new culture. They were given new names, a different approach to all of those sorts of things. And so the context of this is as he moves through some of these things, he moves through it, and then he ends up getting an enormous amount of influence. And he ends up becoming this extraordinary leader, and he rises not just to power, but with such favor with the people who are overseeing all of it, that he gets so much influence in the kingdom. And so that's where we're going to be picking up. This is in Daniel chapter 6. We're going to pick up at verse 1. Here's what it says. It says, "It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom." Now, this idea, I'll try to make it, again, super simple. He's essentially got all these little provinces throughout the kingdom, 120 sort of leaders throughout this, governors, mayors, however you want to think about it. These are the point leaders for these specific areas of the kingdom that they were in. And then you get this. You have those guys, and then you have 3 administrators who are going to be over the 120. And one of them was Daniel. So again, if you're going to picture this, you got king, he's the guy. And then you got 3 administrators, Daniel being one of them, and then 120 other leaders, right? This is pyramid scheme thing. I'm just kidding. But you get the point. There's point leadership happening right here, right? And Daniel was one kind of on that second tier. And the satraps were made accountable to these administrators so that the king might not suffer loss. And again, this is basic leadership business stuff. At the end of the day, he needed to spread his influence out amongst a group of people, and that's what he was doing. And Daniel had garnered so much influence that he became one of the top 3. Now, what happens next is kind of fun, and this probably sounds like your workplace sometimes. Here's what it says. It says, "Now Daniel so distinguished himself," and I love this part. He so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So here's the goal with Daniel, right? He's like, you've done so good and you've garnered so much influence. So we're not just going to make it 120 and then 3 and the king. We'll make it like 120 and then the other administrators and then you and then the king. And you're going to be sort of like second in command of the whole sort of thing. Now, what happens next is what happens when a lot of people gain influence and sort of gain influence or gain leadership. It says this. It says, "At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel and his conduct of government affairs." Now, this is the fun part. This is where they get on Twitter, right? They get on Twitter, and they look back 15 years. And can we dig up this tweet? Can we find that thing? What's the thing in his past? What's the skeleton in his closet that we could find that when we drag it out, he's going to lose the influence that he has garnered along the way? This doesn't sound that different, right? This is kind of politics now. This is just kind of what happens in your work. This happens all over the place. That if he's going to be leader, there's a group of people who go, we are going to find something against him. And then it goes on, and this is so fun to look at. It says, but they were unable to do so. They hired their private eye. They get the little AI bots to go find whatever. And they came up with nothing. And then it says this, they could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. This was Daniel we're running right now. Am I right? Like, just give me a little bit of that. There's a little bit of, like, there was nothing to be found with him. And then in verse 5, you get sort of the pinnacle part of this verse, and this is where we're going to kind of spend the bulk of our time today. It says, finally, these men, they said this, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. Now, this is what's so fascinating, so fun, and If I look at it, they kind of just gave up. They kind of go, look, we've done the thing, we've looked, and we've turned over every stone, and we've searched Twitter, and we've looked at emails, and we've done all this stuff. We can't find anything against Daniel unless we find something that's connected to the religion that he had or the religion that we were sort of indoctrinating or moving him towards. We just can't find it. Now, when I grew up around this passage, the funny thing about this is that oftentimes the end point to this would be like, so Daniel was a good dude. Like that was kind of the go be like Daniel, which is true. Go be like Daniel, that'd be great. But what often is missed is that along the way, before he was ever sort of taken into all of the things that are going on through all the cultural sort of dynamics, at some point along the way, the thing that had been passed down and passed down and passed down and passed down generations to him rested in him. And he was on a trajectory towards trying to please God. And if there was a path that he had already pointed his life on that had been settled in him, that at some point along the way, we look at it this way, that Daniel had already chosen who he wanted to become. And this actually set a trajectory for him along the way. Now, you've heard us talk about predetermining your decisions if you've been around here for a while. You've heard us talk about character in these sorts of ways. I'll say all the time that when it comes to following Jesus, so much of this, you get to see what Jesus would have us to do, and even if you don't agree or even if it doesn't feel like, like the easy decision, you can predetermine to choose to follow him in those moments. But what Daniel did is he set a course for who he was going to be. Now, if you're here and you're single, one of the things that I tell people who are engaged or single and dating and looking, all these kinds of things, is that long before you figure out who you're going to be with, the best thing that you could do is figure out who you want to be. I think I put it in my notes this way. You got to choose who you want to be before you determine whose you want to be. Now, I said this last week, too, at the end of the message. Now, for people who are followers of Jesus, what happens for many of us is you go like, I am setting myself on a trajectory that I am following Jesus. I've given him my life. I'm open-handed. I am running in this direction. And then often what happens is you become so clear on who God has called you to be and what you're chasing after, and you're going this way. And all of a sudden, somebody comes up, and they're doing the same thing, but they start running beside you. And then all of a sudden, you're both moving in the same direction in proximity to one another, and there's something that happens when you do that. But the opposite of this is also true, is that oftentimes people have no idea what their personal core values are. Oftentimes they have no idea about the trajectory that they're going to be on, or it's so broad that they don't have boundaries that cause sirens to go off when they get close to catastrophe or get close to being who God has not called them to be. And then all of a sudden you get into a relationship, and you've seen this. Some of you have dated people like this. Some of you have a sibling that's doing this now. And they get into a relationship, and they just slowly begin to do this in a different direction. They slowly begin to become somebody who they didn't want to be. Or sometimes even worse yet, they don't do that. What happens is that they still move in their direction. The other person moves in theirs, and it gets so tense. It's like two people who are playing tug of war for the next 40 years on who they're trying to be. And either one of those things creates so much tension, or it moves a person away from who they were supposed to be. And so I tell people all the time, the best thing that you could do if you're not married is to figure out who God is calling you to be and create values around the direction that you're going in. Now, if you are married, what I'll tell you is this, that if you are married, you have to choose to be the one that God has called you to be and then love selflessly, right? Which means this, that you have to discover who God has made you uniquely to be and set a course for where you're heading, even within your marriage, and go, I am chasing after God open-handedly in this thing, and then I'm going to love my spouse open-handedly and selflessly. Every once in a while I get somebody who's going like, I'm married and they're not a follower of Jesus, and what do I do? I was like, oh, that's easy. You chase after who God's calling you to be, and then you serve and you love your spouse so well that Christianity at least feels irresistible because of the ways that you live your life. Because you have decided who you're going to be in the trajectory that you're on, and you've created those guardrails in your life. Now, I've said all that. Here's what I want to do. What I want to do is I'm going to give you a framework for the next few minutes that I have been doing for the last lots of years, right? And this is not the only one. In fact, you could probably come up with something better, and you could figure some of this out on your own. But there's a piece of you, now come on, if we're just really honest, it goes, I am clear on some things, but I might not be fully clear on this. Or if you're here and you're dating, or you're engaged, or you're like serious, or those sort of things, I would just tell you this. In those instances, I think what we're about to talk about is one of the most important things that you could ever do. It's one of the greatest gifts you could give yourself and your future spouse. And if you're here and you're married, I'll tell you this. The healthiest thing that you could do, I think, in your marriage, I mean, you need to go get counseling, you do all those kinds of things. But if there's a piece of your marriage that feels broken, one of the best things that you could do is to dive in so deeply to what we're going to talk about as a couple and create clarity around what this looks like for you. Now, I'm going to give you one more caveat, and I'm going to kind of give you the framework. The caveat is this. A lot of people will look at what I'm about to talk about and say, what you do is you set that standard so high that it's really hard to meet or nobody can meet it. And I'm going to take a second and I'm going to say this. Yes, we're about to set a really high standard, and I also know you're not perfect and you're not going to be. But you meet high standards all the time. And you rise to those standards all the time. I'll give you a great example. How many of you drive in the room? Where are my drivers at? Come on, just be proud of it. You did it. You got to 15 and you did it. You know what I mean? Now, I'm just going to tell you that you have preferences around driving. I've driven to Florida. I think the speed limit's wrong in Florida. I'll just tell you, I think we should we go faster in Florida. Now, we're going to pay for it because it's so expensive, but you do that. Now, I'm just going to tell you this. You meet a standard of driving every time you get behind the wheel, and you know what? We all want you to, right? I'm not going to lower the standard of your driving skills to meet your preference. If you come towards my minivan at 90 miles an hour, I'm not going to be good with that. This is not about your preference. This is actually about you rising to the standard of what a good person who drives should do. Now, in the snow, it's different, but you get it. Like in those moments, that's what we're saying. So here's what I'm going to tell you. You apply this in other places. You look at your job, somebody sets a standard, and you either meet it or you don't work there anymore. It's not like I don't know if I get to do this. When it comes to marriage, it is so much more important than the other things that you meet the standard on. Why would we not raise the standard on what it looks like to become the people who exist in marriage in healthy ways? So if any part of you goes, man, that feels like a high standard. Yeah, because it's forever. You know what I mean? You stood at an altar and you said 1 Corinthians whatever, and you said the thing, and then you said I do, and then babies. You know what I mean? Like that's what happens. And all just kidding. You're welcome for that one. There's a little bit of that. So I'm going to say we're going to set a high standard of what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes because of this. That the standard that you set, right? The standard that you set communicates the value that you ascribe to the thing that you put the standard on. And marriage deserves a high standard. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about two things in particular, and this is how we're going to approach it. First thing is this. I think you have to get really great at developing personal clarity. Now, we've already been talking about this. Some of you have heard me teach on pieces of this before. You have to develop personal clarity on what you're actually doing, which revolves around two specific questions. The first question is this. What is my personal definition of success? Stephen Covey made this famous, I think back in the late 80s, early 90s, right? What's my personal definition of success? But the harder question to answer around this isn't just what's my personal definition of success. A lot of people can end up defining that. The harder question is what's at stake if I don't achieve it? Now, let me tell you this. If you're dating somebody, they can't answer either one of these questions for you. In marriage, come on, you know this too. In marriage, your spouse can't answer either one of these questions for you fully. They just can't do it. You have to answer these questions because it is uniquely personal to you. Now, what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about some of these values in a second, but I'm going to do something that I haven't done before. Some of you heard me talk about how I created values. What I did was I was 18 years old. I got away to a cabin in the woods in the middle of nowhere in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. Scared the mess out of me. Something about being in the woods with no lights in a cabin that just doesn't feel great, but I took a journal and I wrote down a bunch of words that I wanted to be guardrails for my life. I came out with so many of them. And my goal was to create a set of guardrails for my life that would help guard away from creating regret in some of the most important areas. Now, we're going to talk about that in a second. What we've never talked about, and I've never really kind of shared before, is long before that, I played baseball, and I was young, and I grew fast, which helped me be a better baseball player than most 13-year-olds because I was 6'1" at 13. I looked like this, just 50 pounds left. You know what I mean? Like I looked like this. And so everybody else just weren't quite my size. And so I was playing well back then. I had a pitching coach who had played in the majors for the Braves, because go Braves. And he came, and And what he did is he did like a few sessions with me, and I'll never forget this. And I was like 13. And he looks at me and he said this. He goes, there's a lot of talented baseball players who never make it to the majors. And here's what he said, because they don't have a vision or a plan for where they're going. It's one of the best homework assignments. This is worth the money to get him to be your pitching coach. And he says, I want you to go off, and I want you to write down what you hope to become when it comes to Major League Baseball, which is the Braves. I mean, at the end of it, there's one word, Atlanta Braves. Well, two words, South Carolina. Anyway, I wanted to go do that. Now, here's what I did, though, and this is like 13. I went off, and I started writing all of that down. And when I did, I got to the point that I realized, and I liked baseball. That wasn't going to be my whole life. That wasn't what I wanted to do. And so I actually took his assignment and applied it to things that I thought were the biggest categories for me. Now, I'm going to tell you this. My categories are likely not your categories. And my brokenness is not your brokenness. And my vision for my life and my future is going to be very different than yours. But what I did is I went and I tried to apply this to the areas that mattered most. Now, I'm going to give you one more caveat, and then I'm going to read some of these to you. What happened for me during that time is I actually developed these things over the course of about 6 months-ish. And what's fascinating is I'm 36 now. I've added one, and I've rephrased 3. Outside of that, they haven't really changed. And I think that's kind of the beauty and the power of being strategic about thinking about the direction that you're heading in. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read just some of mine so that you can have a version of what this looks like. And then what I'm going to challenge you to do is I'm going to ask you to go back and develop yours if you've never done this before. And so when it comes to me, my personal definition of success, when I get to the end of my life, what do I hope is going on? The first thing is this. My wife, Emily, now this didn't have her name in it in the beginning because I was 13. So there was a little bit of this. As it came through, it was this, that Emily would be glad that she chose me and know that I partnered with her in her unique calling. Now let me show you what's not a part of this before we get all like feely and notebook and all that kind of stuff. Is this. I met Emily when we were at college. Most of you all have seen Emily or know Emily. And I mean this, she could have had most any guy that she wanted in college, right? She's great. She's a big deal. All my friends, but we don't talk to those guys anymore. Just kidding. Not the guys that liked her. Anyway, there's a little bit of that. But I'll just say, she really could have. Now, here's what's fascinating. This was me in college. So if you think, if you don't believe in miracles, here you go. This was me. I worked with middle school students as a middle school pastor. There wasn't a lot going for me. You know what I mean? It just wasn't happening. Now, I'll just tell you, some of you are like, there is a God. Anyway, so there's a bit of that. But here's what I know, and this is what I know intuitively, right? And that's this, that at some point along the way, and I'm joking about kind of me, but it's not depreciating me in this. It's going, she could have chosen someone else. She made a decision to be with me, which creates this moment where I go, at the end of my life, at the end of her life, I want her to be glad that she picked me. Now, a lot of people are like, well, what about loving her selflessly? And what about romantic dates? And well, come on, you know this. If I don't do those things by the end of my life, she might lie about it, but she's not going to be deeply glad that she picked me. So what happens is I want to create something that's going to draw all of my habits and decision making into the place that goes, I'm glad she picked me. The other part about this that's unique is in our home, we believe in mutual submission, right? And so I believe that she has a unique calling for her, and I have a unique calling for me, and together we do this thing. If I'm spending a lot of my energy going, what are you called to do, and how can I support you? And she's asking the same question. It's the fun thing about marriage, ready? Here's the life hack. And you both keep, how can I serve you? How can I serve you? It is hard to fight when you're asking somebody, how can I serve you? It is really hard to have a tense relationship when you're trying to one-up each other on serving the other person. It's just hard to do. I'm sure it can be done. We all have that uncle. But I'm just saying, it's hard for us. So for us, we go, I want her to be glad, and then I want us to focus on our unique calling. The second one for me is this. I grew up without a dad in the home, so I knew early on this was a part of what I wanted to do. But I want the initial thought that my kids have about me, especially when I'm gone, to be one that's full of affection. Now, it used to be some version of I want them to respect me or whatever that is, which is all good things. And then I met families where you go like, and you just know this, you can hear it in the kid's voice whether they're saying the thing or not, where they either have affection around their father or they don't. And I'll just tell you, this is a guiding principle to help make my decisions line up with where I want to go. Is at the end of my life, when I'm gone, if you ask my kids about me, all right, I want to have had their heart. And this is different. This is different than checking all the boxes. This is different than, do all the right things. This is different than, it's even different than respect. At the end of the day, a lot of those things come when you fight for the heart. And so a guiding principle for me, success for me as a dad, has more to do with do I have their heart than not. What this forces you to do, for those of you who are dads, is it forces you to apologize quicker. And my personality needs that. You know what I mean? It forces me to have quicker empathy because I am fighting for my kid's heart. And here's the other thing too, and this is bonus, we're not doing a parenting series, about to say. What it also forces you to do is to see every child uniquely, because you cannot have the heart of every one of your children if you parent them all the same. And so for me, personal definition of success when it comes to my kids is this. Now, the other one that I'm gonna show you, I added about 6 years ago. And that one's this. And this is not for all of us, but this is for me. In the last third of my mom's life, that she could say with integrity that I was a good son specifically to her. Now, I'll tell you, this is just me. Now, again, this isn't all, some of you in your 20s are like, I don't think about that at all. And I didn't think about it in my 20s either. I've got from 15, 16, 17 to 22-ish, where I was so preoccupied with developing talent and skill. And then I got from 22 to 27, and I had something to prove. I don't know who I was proving it to, but I had something to prove to somebody out there who was not looking on and did not care. But that was my season of life where I had something to prove. And then you get married, and you get way too busy with marriage and kids to prove anything to anybody. You're just changing diapers and trying to sleep and drinking a lot of coffee. So there's a little bit of that, there's a little bit of that. So I'll just tell you that season of my life where I would say I was preoccupied really until about 30 with everything else. And I'll tell you, if you're here and you're 22 and you're like, that's the last thing on my mind, that's okay. I don't think you just decided. But at some point along the way, you start doing stop this train John Mayer math. You know what I'm talking about? If you don't, go listen to that song, Cry by Yourself. It's great. But in that time span, you start doing math about the time that you have left. And the cyclical part of the parenting journey, and I'm 36, so, I think about this way off. I think about this. They're with you in the earliest stages, and they would never say this, but they're putting up with you in some of the other stages, you know what I mean? And they're always shaping your heart. And at some point along the way, for most 20-somethings, there is a view of it is transactional based off of what they can give you or what they've done for you. And here's how you know. And if you find yourself short in every phone call, you know that there's some version of transaction that's happening, right? And then there comes a phase of your life, and for some people, it doesn't come until after their parents are gone. I just decided I didn't want that to be the case. But for me, the last third of my mom's life, I wanted her to be able to say with integrity that I was a good son to her, that I was focused on that to some degree. Now, I can't do everything. Again, I can't do everything that she wants or needs. I'm not here to do that. But at the end of the day, I want to make decisions based off of that as much as I can, right? And here's the thing about that. And again, I'll shut up after this. Is your mom or some of your dads too, they will lie at the end of their life about what a good kid you were. They will. They're not going to sit around with their family and go, yeah, for the last 15 years, my kids sucked. Nobody's going to say that. Nobody's going to say that. And this is why I would say, but they and their internal narrative in their mind and their heart will know if you were also loving and selfless to them. And what's fascinating about the New Testament is you see this in the New Testament, what it looks like to honor your parents. I'm just going to say that. So I wanted to do that. That's one of the things that guides my values. The other one is this. This is fun. That a small group of people will be able to say that I was a lifelong friend. Some of you have this, some of you don't. And this is where I used to have all these emotion verbs around this, and I'll just be really honest. I'm, in my 30s now, I would go like, I don't feel all of the emotions around this as much anymore. I'll say this, that I want to get to the end of my life, and there will be a handful of people that I committed to getting to the end of my life when it comes to friendship with. And for some of them, it's going to be sliding in with a lot of scars and pain. And for some of them, it's going to be really easy. For some of them, healing has already happened. For some of them, healing is going to happen later. There's all versions of this, but there's a small group of people in my life that by the time I get to the end of my life, I want to go, hey, it might be messy and painful because friendship is, but whenever I get there, right, we might not be able to say everything around it, but that we were lifelong friends because we decided to be, right? And the reason that I got to this place, and the reason it was a guiding principle, and the reason that I chose it when I was young, is because you know people who get to the end of their life, and there's always a reason to hold on to something that disqualifies and ends a friendship at some point. That doesn't mean boundaries. You got to be wise about all that for sure. But you will always have an excuse to end a friendship. But at some point, you have to decide, these are the handful of people that I'm going to slide in messy and broken. We're all kind of beat up a little bit. We're all bruised. It's all built. I don't know. But we got to the end because we decided to. Right? The other one is this, and this is you. This is a lot of you, and this is kind of my connection to you. That the people that I lead would have, and I put A because I wanted to emphasize A, not the A model of a deeply flawed person who loves and follows Jesus. Now, there was a season of my life where I wanted to be a speaker, which is great, woohoo. And then there was a season where I wanted to be a good pastor, a season where it was all about leadership, and all I did was read about leadership, and I love leadership, I love pastoring, I love speaking. But I got to the point where there was a point of veneer to all of that when it comes to what I did. There was a little level like of fakeness to that. And what I found is this, and again, most of you aren't trying to be pastors, but I'll say this. This is true of leaders. That's this. The men that I found and the women that I found in their 70s and 80s, they had gotten to a place where they didn't feel like they needed a veneer to lead people. They led out of their brokenness and vulnerability, and they didn't hide the flaws. And part of that is because they didn't feel like they had anything to lose a lot of times at that stage. And so I was like, what if you could reverse engineer that and do that earlier in leadership? Now, I'll just tell you, this is what I say. When you remove the veneer of whatever those things are, and you acknowledge the deeply flawedness of you as a human, and you do whatever it is that you do in your work and whatever you invest your time in from that place, it's not about you being real. What does that even mean? But it is a version or a model of a human following Jesus wildly and perfectly. Right? And that, I think, is one of the healthiest places you could be, anything you're doing. And then the last one is this, is I want to love Jesus more on my last day than the first day I chose to follow him, right? And that's kind of the overarching guiding thing. Now, I'll tell you why I put that in there the way that I did. The reason I said it that way is, at the end of the day, I don't want to love Christianity more. I don't want to love a set of values more. I don't want to even love like the Orthodox, whatever. I mean, I believe in all those things, and I'm certainly there. I want to love the person of Jesus more than I did when I started following him when I was younger. And here's what you also know, is in most of our lives, the ups and downs and navigating all of those things, it feels like a weird graph, you know what I mean? And so the reason I put it this way is like, I want to steward that relationship so well, where I'm almost like getting it to the end of my life and going, hey, I love him more now than I did when I started. Okay, that's mine. My challenge to you is if you don't have an answer to that question, what is personal success like? I think you have to answer it. Now, I'm going to say one last sort of segment of things around this, and then we're going to pray and we're just going to send you out, right? So this is going to be uber practical. Thanks for coming. Let's go eat lunch, all right? But here's the last segment of this, is if you get that down and clear, then the next thing for you is to decide, what does failure look like? Now, here's what I mean by this. And your failure on those things will be different than everybody else's. I used to think that like values in organizations and values personally always felt a little weird. Like you put them on a wall, but they don't mean anything. And a lot of them don't. But for you, this is why they're personal. I don't even know that you have to share these with everybody. I don't share mine with everybody. When I talk about this, I only give 2 out because I don't want everybody to know. But the things around my brokenness and my propensity and my personality and my own sin, what are the guardrails that I can create that are far enough away from catastrophe that send off alarms and red flags and sirens and fire trucks and cops, not real life, hopefully, but all those things that show up and say, you got too close to failure, course correct, right? So I'm gonna give you 2. I give you the same 2 every time. Here's 2 of mine. First one is on purity. Part of this because as a pastor, I grew up around a lot of pastors who made bad decisions around this. I never wanted that. I never want that reputation. I want to be so far away from that. And the reason for me, right, the reason this matters is I will guard intimacy through exclusivity because I believe that intimacy is fostered through exclusivity. You know, we talked about sex last week. We'll talk about sex throughout the rest of the series at some point. And everybody's like, why wait till marriage? This is one of the, of course you said that. And I was like, come on, because the reason is, right, that intimacy is fostered through exclusivity. And everybody agrees, well, not everybody, most people agree with this when you get married because you want exclusivity when you get married. The question becomes before. And come on, and you know this, exclusivity breeds intimacy. Right? And so for me, I would say, I take this seriously. This is kind of a big deal for me, right? And the reason it's a big deal is because if I'm not, I diminish or at times, and you've seen this, eliminate intimacy in my most important relationships. So this was interesting for me in college. It was interesting to me for when we were engaged and married. And then with what I do, there's all sorts of things attached to this. I rarely, if ever, and I'm not saying you need to do this, I rarely, if ever, meet with somebody alone of the opposite sex. It's happened less than 5 times in my life. And every time it does, they feel awkward, I feel awkward. Well, I'm awkward anyway, but it just feels a little bit like that. And you go like, why is it? Because I don't want there to ever be a question around that. And some of you go, well, my job, I can't do that. I get that. I'm not saying you need to do that. I'm just saying I want to take it seriously. I want to be so far away from it, right? This is the other thing with pornography, these kinds of things. I always think it's fascinating. The question isn't around is watching pornography, whatever. The question around pornography is always are you protecting exclusivity in your most important relationship to breathe the intimacy that God wants for your life? And this is the thing, if you get close to it, if there's a thing that you something feels off, let the sirens go off in your mind and your heart far before something massive happens that affects you, your spouse, your kids, and everybody within your scope of influence. All right? Create those guardrails far enough away from catastrophe. So there's an effect. The other one is this, and this is me. So this is one very specific one. I always want to be approachable, right? It just goes against my natural bent and personality. And I want to be consciously respond as if the person in front of me is the most important person. Because if I'm not, I diminish or eliminate opportunities to invest in other people. Now, this is probably not yours because you're so good with people and all that, but I'm naturally wildly introverted. And so I remember as a kid going, I want to be approachable. I got to learn this. So the way that we talk about this at our house and with my kids, I have a guardrail here, right? I look at at the end of the week, how often do I get interrupted by my kids, right? Now, this is just me. This is not yours. The alarms go off if I don't get interrupted. And here's why. Because if my kids don't feel like they can interrupt me, they don't think they can come to me, or they think whatever's in front of me is more important than them. And the problem is, I like all y'all, but y'all not as important as my kids. So sometimes I'll be talking to you on a Sunday, my kids will walk up, I love you, but I always get down with them. You know what I mean? Or I always put my arm, and that's for me, because I want to be approachable to my family. I never want Emily to go, I don't know if I could talk to him now. Yes. I'll be in meetings. We were in a fundraising meeting one time. This is kind of fun. And I was asking for a lot of money when we didn't have hardly any money. And I got a call from somebody in my family that's on that very short list. I took the call in front of them. He's like, well, what if you gave up the money? I was like, the money isn't near as important as the approachability thing, because the alarms go off, the sirens go off. And here's the thing that you know, and here's what I know. Missing one of those, we'll probably be okay. Eleanor coming up to me, Dad, she got her Barbie. Daddy, look at the Barbie thing. I dressed her, all this kind of stuff. Dad, if I missed that one, is she going to go into counseling when she's 36 going, Daddy doesn't love me? I don't think so, not off of one. But here's what you know, and here's what I know. That over the course of time, the compounding effect of not being approachable creates distance and an assumed reality where there's something else more important. Now, you don't struggle with that like I do. I struggle with that, which means it is one of my personal guardrails, core values, and the alarms go off, and I always want them to go off. And so here's my thing for you. Where do your alarms go off in your own heart? And if they never go off, it's likely not because they shouldn't be. It's likely because you don't have clarity around what those guardrails are for you. Last thing we're going to say, and we're going to wrap up, is this, and I think you got to pay attention to the details. You can do all of the stuff that we just talked about, every bit of it. And here's what I know, and here's what you know. You are talented enough, smart enough, good enough to convince yourself out of the decision making around this that you should be making. I say this all the time. I'll say it as long as you attend church here. I put it this way. The inner justification is almost always evidence of inner manipulation. When you find a version of yourself trying to convince yourself of something, generally you are good at manipulating yourself away from where you need to be. And so here's the solution. Are you ready? Don't do that. Just don't do that. Like, but what do I, just don't. When you catch yourself, let that be an alarm for you. I am convincing myself that I should, you fill in the blank, or that this step beyond the line that I set over there is actually going to be okay. No. Or for me, again, this meeting is really important and I can miss I mean, yeah, that thing will take you far away over time from where you were called to be. And the last thing we're going to say, and then we're going to wrap up, is this. I think you have to identify what you hope that you're never asked about. Somebody told me this when I was in college, and it was one of the most liberating things. If you want to know where the cracks in your character are, look at the places, not that you're even attempting to hide, but that you just hope nobody ever asks you about. Not that you would lie about it, not that you would even twist it, but that you're just like deep down somewhere in the back of your head, like, I hope they don't ask about that thing. And I'll tell you this, when you answer that honestly, the pieces of your heart that have moved away from your strategic vision for your own life, come on, it just bubbles up so fast in those places. So I'm going to give you these 3 questions at the end. Let's do that, and then I'm going to essentially pray for you, and then we're going to wrap up. 3 questions that I want you to be thinking about over the course of this next week are this. Who are you going to be? If you're married, you put a pin in this date and you look forward 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, or even better yet, at the end of your life. Who are you going to be? Who is God calling you to be? Second one is, what is personal success for you? And I'll say this, you can be broad, but the more specific you are, the more protection you have with your life, right? What's personal success for you? And then what do you want to be remembered for? What do you want to be remembered for? Your spouse is going to tell a story one day about you, either to herself or himself. And it might be internal. They may never say it to anybody else, but there's going to be a story about you. What story do you want them to tell? Your kids are going to tell a story about you one day. What story do you want them to tell? If you're a leader in the room, the people that you lead, they will tell stories about you. They'll just be more vocal about it. You know what I mean? Than your kid, probably. But what story do you want them to tell? What do you want to be remembered for? What do you hope that your life is remembered for? And when you get those questions down, then you work so hard to create the boundaries to make sure you move in that direction. So what I'm going to do to wrap up is I'm going to ask if you would close your eyes for a second, bow your heads. I just dumped a ton of information on you. I know that. There's a lot in that talk. I know that. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to ask yourself, really honestly, have you done that work yet? Like, do you have not like a general answer, but do you have a clear answer around that? Do you have an exportable answer around that? What is your personal definition of success? What are the guardrails around your heart and your life? And if you don't, what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you over the course of this week to actually go and do the work. Some of you need to take a day off of work this week. One of the most life-giving things that some of you could do for your marriage is say, I'm going to go to a cabin for a weekend and work on this. Some of you, come on, you know this, some of you are dating people that you know have pulled you away from what you've already clarified. And the best thing you could do, it sounds so bad, but like, it's true, the best thing you could do is in the relationship, be more of who God's called you to be. Some of you, you're in a relationship with someone and you're clear on this, but you have set a standard where you've lowered it for whatever reason, and it's time for you to raise it because it matters so much and live into what you've been called to do. And some of you in the room, some of you just need to repent because this has been clear for you for a long time. You just got comfortable being so close to the line of catastrophe. So Father, we ask that through this or some other version of this, that you would help us to be so unbelievably clear about who you've called us to be and who you've made us to be. Father, I ask that you would help us to do the hard work internally of determining and trusting you with it. And Father, I ask that you would help us to do whatever comes out of that when it comes to our relationships. And God, I pray that over the course of our lives, as we think about where we're headed and where we're going and the life that we're building, the marriages that we're building, the families that we're building, the organizations, the businesses, the things that we build, Father, they would be so rooted in this kind of character. And the stories that we get told about our lives would point back to the power and the beauty of you. We thank you for that. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.